Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm talking about why I prefer Sega over everybody else. So I previously did a video on my personal journey through the years with Nintendo, and I focused exclusively on Nintendo, but I didn't only exclusively play or own Nintendo through the years. I actually was more of a Sega gamer, and I did have some PlayStation and Xbox consoles and other stuff like Atari and things like that. So I wanted to touch on why I love Sega so much. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. During the 8-bit era, we had an NES. My family did. But one of my friends had a Sega Master System, and I remember going to their house, and I remember being blown away by Sonic the Hedgehog. And I remember thinking that was so much better than anything that was on Nintendo. And I remember wanting to get a Sega Master System, but my parents wouldn't let me because they just bought the NES 2 years ago, 2 years prior. So they're like, we're not buying a new console. We got our NES. It wasn't 2 years prior. Holy shit. We got our NES in 1988, and this was 1991, 89, 90, 91. So it was 3 years prior. So we really hadn't gotten our money's worth out of the NES yet, so they weren't ready to upgrade, and the Master System was a marginal upgrade. It wasn't a next gen system. It was a current gen system that was just slightly more powerful than the NES in some respects. But it was very lacking in the software department. But I remember that this piqued my interest. And so in 1992, or 93, excuse me, Christmas of 1993, my parents bought us a Super Nintendo. And they got it for the family for Christmas. However, my sister, one of my sisters, found the receipt, the layaway receipt, and shared it with all of us kids. And because my mom found out, she canceled the layaway and took everything back. So we ended up not getting a Super Nintendo in 1993. This disappointed me because I really wanted the Super Nintendo. I was really looking forward to it because I was a really big fan of Mega Man and Castlevania and Mario and Zelda and some other Nintendo games that were real popular at the time. I loved the NES. It had a lot of great games on it, a lot of classic games. And I wanted to get a Super Nintendo because I wanted to play that Zelda game that was out. I remember really wanting that Zelda game and also Super Mario World because I liked Mario at the time. I still do. In fact, Mario's the only thing I like that Nintendo does out of everything that they do. Mario's my favorite. So I'll give them props for that. So I was sitting on the school bus coming home from school, and a kid was showing me his Sega Game Gear. Now, one of my best friends had a Game Boy, and I remember thinking the Game Boy was a toy. The Sega Game Gear was a console. This was a video game machine. The Game Boy was a toy, so I was not impressed with the Game Boy. So I remember wanting a Game Gear. So I asked my parents if they could get me a Game Gear. And they were like, well, it's a handheld, so it's not the same thing as a home console, so it wouldn't be replacing the NES. It would be its own thing. They looked at the price tag and they said no, because it was pretty expensive, especially compared to the Game Boy. It was really expensive. So they got me 3 Tiger handhelds for Christmas instead, which was very disappointing because I wanted a Game Gear and I got Tiger handhelds. If you've ever played a Tiger handheld, you know how disappointing that is. They suck. I got X-Men, I got Sonic 3, and I got I don't remember the third one. This is so long ago. This was 1993. Christmas 1993. I don't remember what the third one was. But I do remember playing the X-Men one and playing the Sonic 3 one a lot. And I remember liking the Sonic 3 one because I loved Sonic the Hedgehog, and I was really hyped for Sega. Well, 1990, this was Christmas 93. 1994 rolls around, and I'm turning 12. I turned 12 in September 1994. And that same kid who had the Game Gear had those little pamphlets, and he would show me the Sega pamphlets. And I remember looking at the thing called the Sega Genesis, the 16-bit Sega Genesis. I didn't know what 16-bit meant. But by reading magazine articles, I learned the NES was only 8 bits. The Sega Genesis was a whole 16 bits. So I told my parents, you got to get me a Sega Genesis. It's a 16 bits. And understandably, my parents are like, what the hell are bits? And I'm like, it means it's better. And they're like, what does that mean? And I'm like, it plays better games. It looks better. It's more fun. It's newer. It's cooler. And so to my surprise and absolute delight, my parents got me a Sega Genesis for my 12th birthday. This was a big deal because, I am transgender, but I was raised a boy, obviously. And so I was the only boy in a house of girls. I had 3 sisters. And so the NES was a family purchase, meaning I had to share it with my sisters. It belonged to all of us, mom, dad, and my sisters and me. The Genesis was mine. I did not have to share it. I did not have to let my sisters play it. They let me put it in my bedroom. The NES was hooked up in the living room so everyone could play it. This was mine. This was the very first time I had a game system that belonged exclusively to me, and I fucking loved it. I had Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and then I got, through the mail-away offer, when you bought the Genesis back then, this was in 1994, they had a mail-away offer if you send in, proof of purchase and, shipping and handling or whatever, you could get a free game. And I ended up ordering Toe Jam and Earl 2 Panic on Funkatron, because I remember seeing a commercial for it, and I was real big into hip-hop at the time, and even though it's funk, hip-hop and funk are in the same family. They're like cousins. And I listen to some funk, but I prefer hip-hop. Specifically, I listen to gangster rap. I listen to G-funk. So even though I'm listening to rap music, it is funk. So I was really enamored by this Toe Jam and Earl Panic on Funkatron. And so they got me that game as my mail-away offer. And I was very excited. And I begged my mom to buy me a 6-button controller because it said it was 6-button controller compatible and the 3-button controller sucked. So she did. She bought me just one-off, not even a birthday present or anything. She just bought me a 6-button controller. So I could play the game the way it was intended to be played. And I thought this was really cool. Now remember, I turned 12 in September. So in September, I got the Genesis, Sonic 2, and Toe Jam and Earl 2. That Christmas, my parents did something they've never done before. They bought me 3 video games all at once. They got a family game for the NES for my sisters to play because they were still playing the NES. And they got me 3, my own games, 3. They got me Mortal Kombat 1, Mortal Kombat 2, and Shinobi 3, Revenge of the Ninja Master. Return of the Ninja Master or Revenge of the Ninja Master? I always forget, but it's the Ninja Master. Shinobi 3 something the Ninja Master. And I couldn't get enough of those games. Now, true story. My parents are conservatives. My mom was a Sunday school teacher. My dad was a Baptist minister. He was a deacon. And so my parents did have a problem with me playing Mortal Kombat because it was violent and it was supposedly satanic. And every fucking thing was satanic in our household. But when I was in grade school, when I was a little kid, I actually had a problem with my hands, which I'm not going to get into here. But I had a doctor's note telling my parents to let me play more video games. And so they had a Mortal Kombat 2 machine at the truck stop where my mom worked at the time. And she saw how popular that game was, even though it was violent and bloody and gory. And so my parents agreed they would get me the Mortal Kombat games if I agreed not to turn the blood on. That was the condition. They said you can play the game without the blood. Now, Mortal Kombat 1 comes default without the blood. You have to turn on the blood through a blood code. Mortal Kombat 2, the blood is on by default. And I told them that. I was like, you can't turn it off on Mortal Kombat 2. And they were like, that's fine. Just don't do the finishers. Don't let us see you do the finishers is what they were really saying. And I had an anger problem. I was in counseling for my anger issues. I had a violent temper because I had been bullied quite a bit and I had gotten fed up with being bullied. So I turned things around and I started fighting back, and then I took it too far and I went from fighting back to actually becoming a bully, which I'm not proud of, but that is my story. And so Mortal Kombat gave me an outlet for my aggression. And so my parents agreed that it was healthier for me to have a violent outlet for my aggression than it was bad for my soul to be playing this satanic video game. which was really weird. My parents were not like that. They would not even let us watch Mrs. Doubtfire because they were scared I was going to grow up and become a trans woman if they did. Yeah, they caught me cross-dressing a couple of times, and they blamed it on my sisters. Because my sisters used to play dress-up, and I would play dress-up with them. Because, I was the only boy in a house full of girls. So my parents would get mad at my sisters and, don't play dress-up with your brother. Even though I liked it. I was always like, yes, can we please play dress-up? I would rather play dress-up than house. Because we would always play house. Because, when you're kids, you play house. Blah, blah, blah. I wasn't allowed to play with their Barbies or their Rainbow Brides or their My Little Ponies. So I would, play dress up because it was the only thing I could do. At this time, my sister was dating this boy who was 18 and she was 15 at the time. So, there's some legality issues there and the cops were called. My parents were really pissed off. But to earn my favor, in order to earn my favor so that I would stick up for him, he gave me a big trash bag full of video game magazines. Sega Visions, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Game Pro, Game Informer, Nintendo Power, everything. This big trash bag full of video game magazines. And then he also gave me some Transformers toys because I was a big Transformers nut. To kind of get on my good side so that I would stick up for him and be on his side when he was trying to fuck my 15-year-old sister. But, I was a boy. I didn't know what sex was at the time, and I didn't know that my sister was having sex until I found out later. So I was like, okay with it, cool. I would tell my parents, he's cool. Let him date. And so I was reading through all of those magazines, and I was learning about Sega CD, 3DO, Neo Geo. I was learning about the upcoming 32X. Remember, this was 1994, so the 32X... I believe the 32X came out in 95, so it was literally right around the corner. Or it may have came out in 94. It may have just come out. I can't remember. But I do remember the reason why they got me Shinobi 3 is they wanted to get me 3 Mortal Kombat games, but Mortal Kombat 3 wasn't out yet. But it was in arcades, but it wasn't on home consoles yet. And so it was one of those, they got me a third ninja game is what it was, because they thought Mortal Kombat was a ninja game. And so I got a job. I got an after-school job, paper delivery, throwing newspapers, and then I got a summer job, detasseling corn in a cornfield, like all the other kids did, because it's what you did when you lived in Nebraska. And I ended up buying a lot of Sega Genesis games used from this grocery store that had a lot of used video games, and from the video stores. We had mom and pop video stores. We never went to Blockbuster because they were too expensive. We didn't have a Hollywood Video. We just had Blockbuster, and then we had like these mom and pop stores. So I would buy video games from the mom and pop stores. So I ended up getting a game called Turrican, which I really loved, and I ended up getting Mega Turrican, also, which I really loved. And then I ended up getting Castlevania Bloodlines, which I really loved. And then I ended up getting a game called Biohazard Battle, which I really loved. And I was noticing a pattern. Every game I got on Sega, I really loved. Now, I have to backtrack for a little bit. I did not have that experience on the NES. The NES, we got Super Mario Brothers Duck Hunt. That was a good game. Our second game was this weird Japanese game called Xyz, Xexyz. It was fun, but it was weird. I can't really explain it. It was like 50% action platformer, 50% shoot 'em up. So it was really weird, but it was really hard. And then they got us Friday the 13th, which was really weird as well. Why would they get us a game based on an R-rated horror movie? Now, let me backtrack a little bit. My parents didn't have their Christian conversion until 1993. So back when we started on the NES, my parents were still into horror movies themselves. My mom and my dad would sit down with us kids and we would watch horror movies as a family because my parents were really into horror movies. So we watched the Friday the 13th movies and the Nightmare on Elm Street movies and Christine and all the Stephen King movies and a whole bunch of other stuff together as a family. So it was like, family fun time. So they got us Friday the 13th, which is a shitty game. It's not a very good game. When you're like, how old was I, 7, 8 years old, it's not a very good game for an 8-year-old because it doesn't make a lot of fucking sense. And you just fucking die and 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 die. So I hated that game. And then they got us a game. They got us Three Stooges, because my dad loves Three Stooges. So we got us a Three Stooges video game, which was fucking stupid. That game sucked. And then I would rent games, but I would always rent like shitty games. You know, I rented Karate Kid. It sucked. I rented Back to the Future. It sucked. I rented just so many games. And so my experience with Nintendo was their games suck. Then I ended up getting The Legend of Zelda from a friend. He loaned it to me. It was his, but he loaned it to me. In exchange, I gave him some Transformers toys, and he let me borrow Legend of Zelda. I played it for a few months, and then he was like, give it back. And I was like, I'm not done yet. And he's like, I don't care, give it back. So I gave it back, and he gave me the Transformers toys back. It was sort of, I'll hold on to your toys for collateral kind of thing. Anyways, so I really liked The Legend of Zelda. And then the other game we had was called Super Spike V-Ball, and it also had World Championship Soccer, NES World Cup Soccer, or something like that. I don't know. You nerds can Google it. It was the 2-cart. That game sucked. I'm not a fan. I'm not a sports fan. That game sucked. So my experience with Nintendo was they fucking suck. But Sega was where it was at. Literally every game I played on Sega, I fell in love with. I did not play one shitty bad game on Sega. Not one. I was playing nothing but bad games on Nintendo. So I had begun to associate Nintendo with shitty games, Sega with awesome games. Now, my parents would not get me a 32X because it was really expensive, and they just bought me the Genesis. And like, you told us this was 16-bit, it was the best of the best of the best, and now you're telling us it's no good, we got to buy this other thing to make it better. And so they were like, no, we're not buying this other thing because you told us this was the best system that was out there. And then I didn't get the 32X, and we weren't even talking about Sega CD. The fucking thing was $300. I wasn't even gonna ask for it. If they were saying no to a $150 32X, they weren't even going to listen to me if I asked for a $300 Sega CD. We were relatively poor. My dad had just lost his job, and so he was in the process of looking for another job. My mom lost her job at the truck stop where she had been a manager making decent money, and now she was working at a convenience store as a clerk. She wasn't making as good money, and Dad was out of work, so we were poor, so they were not going to spend $300 in 1995 on a Sega CD. You have to remember, in 1995, $300 is like $1,000 today. That was a lot of fucking money. So they did not buy me the Sega CD. So then the magazines started hyping up the Project Reality, and later known as the Ultra 64, and then it came out as the Nintendo 64. And so I bought it, and I already told this story, so I'm going to just brush over it. I bought a 64. I went to a pawn shop. I saw a drum set that I really wanted, and they had a Super Nintendo and a shoebox full of games. So I took the 64 back to Kmart, got my money back, went to the pawn shop, got the Super Nintendo, and got the shoebox full of games. And it was hit or miss. There were not a lot of good games. It was just like the NES. One good game, bunch of shitty games, couple of decent games, bunch of crappy games, blah, blah, blah. It was the same experience. So again, I did not have fond memories of the Super Nintendo. I was like, okay, well, Super Mario Brothers, or Super Mario World was good. Tetris Dr. Mario was good. SimCity was good. Mega Man X was good. And Zelda, obviously, was good. But then it was like all these shitty games that were not good. There was this game called Kendo Rage. It fucking sucked. It was like an anime or something. I don't know. It was fucking stupid. It was like a Japanese game. It was really stupid. I got a football game, Pro Action Football or something like that. I don't know. It was fucking dumb. I got a racing game. I don't even fucking remember what it was. It was boring as shit. And then I ended up getting Mario Kart, Super Nintendo, which I did not like at the time. I was not a fan. I ended up getting Star Fox, which I was not a fan of. I thought it sucked. It was really slow, and it was sluggish, and it was boring, and it didn't do anything, and I was just like, this is boring, Nintendo sucks, please stop buying me Nintendo shit. Buy me Sega shit. And then the Saturn had already come out, and then I had been reading up on it on the magazines, but my parents were going to buy me a Saturn, and then I started reading about the Sega Nomad, a portable Sega Genesis. Now my parents weren't going to buy it for me, but they said if I put up X amount of dollars from my job, they would match that, and then I could get the Nomad. So I saved up my money to get a Nomad, and then my friend introduced... Okay, so side quest. One of my friends introduced me to Marvel Overpower. And so I spent all my money on 3 boxes of Marvel Overpower cards because I wanted to get the whole fucking collection because I was obsessed with trading cards at the time. I did not have the money left over to get my Sega Nomad. I was saving up for a Sega Nomad, and I blew all my money on trading cards, which really sucked. So then, in early 2000s, I get a job working at a restaurant as a busser. And I was able to finally start, I'd saved up my money, and I was able to start I was 18 years old now. I was living with my parents. I didn't have a car payment because I owned my car. I didn't have any bills because I lived with my parents. I dropped out of high school, so I didn't go to college. At the time, I would eventually end up going to college, but that's a long story. I took the long way around. And so I was buying a lot of video games at the time. And so I ended up buying a 32X because I really wanted one. I ended up buying a Sega CD because I really wanted one. I bought a Sega Saturn because I really wanted one. And then I almost bought the Dreamcast, but I was not sold on the Dreamcast. I remember being pissed off that the Dreamcast came out when it did because that meant they were killing the Saturn. And I was so enamored by the Saturn, I was angry. I was literally angry that they were killing the Saturn to replace it with the Dreamcast, and I was not impressed with the Dreamcast. I thought the graphics were cool, but the controller sucked. The console did not look good at all. It did not look like the other Sega consoles. It looked like a fucking toy. Sega consoles looked like VCRs or computers or high-end electronics. And here's the Dreamcast. It looks like a goddamn toy. So I hated the Dreamcast, and I was pissed off at Sega. And I was so angry at Sega for throwing in the towel because they got their asses kicked by Sony. I sold my PlayStation because I got a PlayStation for my 18th birthday. I sold my PlayStation and got rid of everything PlayStation, and I swore off Sony, and I said, fuck Sony. They killed Sega. Fuck Sony. I'm done. And so I bought a GameCube instead of a PS2 or a Dreamcast. Xbox wasn't even on my radar because I didn't even know what Xbox was, and it was just like, it's Microsoft, and at the time I was just like, whatever. We'll wait and see. They didn't have any games, so I was like, we'll wait and see, and they never did. They never showed up. Even to this day, 2023, they still haven't made up one fucking game I'm interested in. Sorry, Xbox fans. Excuse me. I need to take a drink. This is where the troubles began. Because Sega, they didn't technically go out of business, but the public perception was they went out of business because they stopped making game consoles and they weren't visible anymore. All of a sudden, all the pawn shops and the retro video game stores and all the comic book shops and everybody that sold video games stopped selling Sega. They clearanced all their Sega stuff. They wouldn't take it in. They wouldn't sell it. They wanted nothing to do with Sega because it was a poison pill. Business owners would tell me, we don't touch Sega because they suck and they're a poison pill. Nobody buys Sega stuff. They don't. They buy Nintendo, they buy PlayStation, they buy Xbox. So it became increasingly difficult for me to find Sega CD and Sega Saturn stuff. Genesis stuff I could find all day long because you can find it in thrift stores. People were still, they were still giving away Genesis stuff. And then I ended up buying a Sega Master System. True story. I owned that Sega Master System and about 15 or so games, 15 to 20 games, for 2 years. 2 solid years. I never hooked it up. I never turned it on. I never played it. Not once. I was deep into GameCube. I had over 60 games on the GameCube during its lifespan. I was obsessed with GameCube. I was deep into the Genesis. I had over 100 games on Genesis. I had about 35 or so Sega CD games. I had about 12, 13 or so. I can't remember. I could sit here and count, but I had about 12 or 13 or so 32X games. I had all the best of the best. So I was like loving Sega, and I was really into GameCube. Why don't I say Game Gear? I didn't have a Game Gear, but I did have a Nomad. I finally got the Nomad that I had always wanted. In 2006, I dropped out of high school to pursue a music career. So I was making rap music and techno music. I was a DJ. I bought turntables, I bought synthesizers, I bought production equipment, all this bullshit. And so I was really like hyper focused on music. So I sold all my video games. I was working at Pizza Hut at the time, living in an apartment with my sister and her roommate. So it was me and there was three of us living in a 2-bedroom apartment. So we were splitting the rent 3 ways. So I was doing pretty good financially. I was doing pretty good. So I sold all my video games and I took the money from that and I started a record studio. I'm not going to tell that story here because it's a long story, but that's how I got rid of all my Sega stuff. What I learned over the years playing Sega Saturn versus playing Nintendo 64, playing Sega Genesis versus playing Super Nintendo, playing, Game Gear versus playing Game Boy, playing Sega CD and 32X versus they didn't have an equivalent on this. Nintendo didn't have an equivalent. I learned that I really appreciated that Sega took risks and they tried new things and they did fun stuff. But I especially like the fact that not once did I play ever a bad Sega game. Not once. Every game I bought on the Sega CD, I loved. Every game I bought on the 32X, I loved. Every game I bought on the Saturn, I loved. Eventually, my sister did get a Dreamcast and she let me play it. I didn't like the Dreamcast. That's another video for another day. That's when going online, I was getting onto the internet, AOL message boards and Yahoo and eventually MySpace and Facebook and Twitter and blah, blah, blah. But I was also getting on message boards and Usenet and stuff like that. I was using the name Sega Gamer 12. And that is still my Steam handle. So if you look for me on Steam, Sega Gamer 12 is my Steam handle. I don't do a lot on Steam, but we'll get into that's another video for another day. I just did a video on PC gaming, why PC gaming sucks, so you can watch that if you want a kind of brief overview. But I'll do a full video, a separate video on Steam specifically, but I'm not a fan of Steam. And that's when I got out of Sega. I lost interest in Nintendo. I lost interest in Sega. And in retro gaming in general, Atari, everything. I was just like, nope. I became hyper-focused on PlayStation. Now I currently own a PS1, a PS2, a PS3, and a PS4. The next system I buy is going to be a PSP or a PS Vita, but probably a PSP because I think they're less expensive. I'm not sure. And I'm just going to be hype. I am now at the point in my life where I'm just going to focus on PlayStation because they got all the fucking games. All the Sega games I like are on PlayStation. All of the games that were on Nintendo that I did like are on PlayStation. All of the PC games that I liked, they're on PlayStation. So I discovered, you know what? PlayStation's where it's at. And that's my story. That's where I am now.